In this video, we're going to be reviewing evolution. And so Charles Darwin is the scientist that gave us our first real evidence and theory of how evolution works through natural selection. And so we know that natural selection works if a variety of factors are present, starting with variation among the offspring. So in order for natural selection to work, there has to be some differences between the individuals of the population. And we know that all species have that variation. There's variation that's due to sexual reproduction. There's variation due to mutations or things like that. So when you have variation in the offspring, and you also have the overproduction of offspring, that in species, more offspring are produced than can possibly survive. And so which of those individuals in the population do survive are the ones that happen to have variations that are most helpful, variations that provide some selective advantage, allow them to get more food or evade predators or find mates. And if those individuals with those variations that are helpful are able to survive more, then they're also more likely to reproduce. And when they reproduce, they pass on those variations to their offspring. And so if you continue this process out for many generations, what you find is that over time, any helpful, beneficial variation that's present in the population will become more common. Any variation that arises that happens to be harmful will become less common over time. And over many generations, this eventually can result in a change in the species as a whole. But the important thing to remember is that individual organisms do not change over time. Individual organisms do not adapt or evolve. It's groups of organisms, populations of organisms that do change over time. An organism is born with specific genes and variations, and they're not going to change over its lifetime. So individuals are not able to evolve. So there's a struggle in nature, and the theory of natural selection tells us that because of competition for resources, competition for mates, to evade predators, there's a struggle for survival. And again, those variations that are helpful, we call them adaptations, allow some of those organisms to be able to survive better. Over time, there's environmental factors that will select which organisms survive, which organisms produce. And so that leads to, over time, the evolution of the species. This process also results in speciation, which is the term that we use for the increase in a number of species. So oftentimes we see speciation when one population gets split and isolated geographically, and each of those split population goes on to adapt in different ways. And eventually those species start to become different from each other. And if they become so different that those two species don't reproduce together anymore, then they are separate species. And so we call that process speciation. So why do species vary? Why is there variation in all species? Well, there's two main reasons. One is mutations, in that when cells are reproducing and copying the DNA and dividing it between cells, there are sometimes mistakes that happen. We call those mistakes mutations, a change in the DNA sequence. Sometimes those changes have no effect. Sometimes those changes might have a negative effect and cause harm to the organism. In those cases, typically those individuals die out. But sometimes those mutations can lead to a helpful adaptation. And if that adaptation is helpful, the individuals that are born with it will survive better, reproduce more, and then that trait is more likely to become more common in the population. The other means of variation is sexual reproduction. In organisms that reproduce sexually, the combining of chromosomes from two different parent cells results in new combinations of traits, new combinations of characteristics. Crossing over during meiosis can result in an increase in variation. So sexually reproducing organisms typically have a higher level of variation than those that produce asexually. And so variations are important in a population because they increase the chance of the survival of that species. If you have a variety of traits, a variety of characteristics and genes, then if there's some disturbance in the environment, if there's a predator or a disease, it's more likely that some individuals may happen to have a variation that allows them to survive, ensuring the survival of the species as a whole. In this slide, we see some examples. We see some of these ladybugs, and they have a variety of different patterns, of different colors, and that variety allows for a greater chance of survival for these ladybug species. And so evolution happens based on these random mutations. So it's not directional. Evolution doesn't try to reach any end. It just happens. And oftentimes in the history of a species, there are branches that don't survive. And we could see that in this cladogram of horses, that the yellow pathway shows the pathway that led to modern horses, genus Equus. And what you also see in white along the way are all of these other branches of that evolutionary tree that didn't lead to modern horses. All of these other species are extinct. They didn't make it to the modern day. And so when we look at these cladograms, we see that the species that share a common ancestor more recently are more closely related. And so if we often will ask, what is the common ancestor of two organisms, the green warbler finch and the gray warbler finch? So if you follow their pathway both backwards, their common ancestor would be here. And the more recently two populations had a common ancestor, the more likely they are to have similar DNA, similar traits and characteristics. And most of the time, natural evolution due to natural selection takes a long period of time. But there are examples of natural selection that has been observed on a shorter time scale. Oftentimes we see this in species that reproduce very quickly. Because they go through generations very quickly, we can often see the results of natural selection over a relatively short period of time. Two examples are the resistance of insects to insecticides and bacteria to antibiotics. When you use, let's say, a pesticide to kill these insects, some of those insects may have variations that allow them to be more resistant to the pesticide. And so when the pesticide is sprayed, most of these individuals die off, but the ones that may happen to be resistant, that might have a resistant gene, if they do survive, then they can go on and reproduce. And when they do that, they're likely to pass on this resistant gene to their offspring. And so when you continue that process out, eventually you could end up with a whole population of these insects that are resistant to the pesticide. The same thing happens with antibiotics and bacteria. If you take an antibiotic for, let's say, strep throat for just a few days and you start to feel better, then you'll kill off the weakest bacteria that happen to have no resistance. But if you leave behind some of those bacteria that have some resistance, they can survive, repopulate, and cause an infection that's then stronger and more resistant to those antibiotics. But again, all of these examples start with variations. There's a selective agent. There's differential survival and reproduction, which over many generations leads to the adaptation and evolution of the population. Oftentimes we may want to determine which species are more closely related, and we can do that in several ways. We can compare their anatomy. We can compare their embryonic development. Some of the best evidence is by comparing biochemistry, comparing their DNA sequences or amino acid sequences in certain proteins. And when we look at this biochemical evidence, we find that oftentimes it contradicts what we might think based on comparative anatomy, that species we thought were closely related by their appearance, maybe not as closely related when we actually look at their DNA and molecular evidence. Also, homologous structures can give us a clue as to evolution. If we look at these mammals that are all shown with their bone structure of their limbs, what we see is even though the outward appearance of a human arm, a cat's leg, a whale's flipper, and a bat's wing may on the outward appear quite different, if you look at the underlying bone structure, they're basically the same. They all have a single upper arm bone, humerus. They have two bones in the forearm, ulna and radius, a series of bones for the wrist, and then the finger bones as well. So they all have that underlying structure, which would give us evidence that all four of these populations, these species, are actually fairly closely related. And we know that's true. They're all mammals. Molecular data is the best way, however, to compare organisms rather than those structural characteristics. Often this is done by comparing proteins or comparing genes between different species. And the more similar their DNA and proteins, the more closely related they are, the more recently they had a common ancestor. Here's an example. If you look at the hemoglobin molecule in different species and compare its amino acid sequence, humans only have one difference in amino acid sequences with a gorilla. 8 with a rhesus monkey, 27 with a mouse, 45 with a chicken, and 67 with a frog. So that should make sense. Humans are most closely related to apes, and the gorilla is an ape. So that's why there's only one amino acid difference. We're quite distantly related to a frog, and that's why there's 67 differences. Those number of differences give us an indication of how related those species are.